Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first week of family violence. I am your instructor, Mr. Adam Dean, and thank you for hanging in there with me. You've gotten through week one, which is kind of like our setup week where you learn kind of my rules and what my expectations are, go over the syllabus. You've gone over some plagiarism stuff because you will have a paper in this class that you will have to do. So that's just kind of some housekeeping stuff that we do during the first week. So this week, we're actually going to dive right in to our material. And we're going to start right at the beginning with Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is intended to give us a foundational basis for which we're going to build upon throughout the rest of the semester. It covers primarily violence against women, and it's a global perspective, which means that we'll be looking at some different countries. As you should have already done the reading, you will know that we'll be looking at some of the violence against women in different countries, and kind of international perspective of how we deal with that. I do want to kind of take this opportunity to say thank you for bearing with me and my ineptness, I guess you could say, with Folio. I am still learning that system. It has been kind of my Achilles heel. So if you see any mistakes or something just doesn't seem right in Folio, I need you to let me know as quickly as possible so that I can get it fixed. On my lecture videos, I do ask that you take notes when you're listening to this lecture, because I will not be posting any of my lecture notes. I know some professors do, some don't. I'm one that I don't post lecture notes. So you need to make sure that you're paying attention, you're in a space where you can sit down and listen to this lecture. I am going to timestamp it to make it easier for you, and that way if you need to step away, pause it, you have a place that you can come back. And then if something didn't make sense, you can come back and listen to me easily finding it through that timestamp. My intention is not to make hour-long videos, but sometimes lectures will run long. So I'm not going to promise that this video is going to be done in 30 minutes. So if you want to listen to it in 15-minute chunks throughout the week, you're more than welcome to do that. Like I said, that timestamp should help you. All right, so are we ready? I want you to sit back and I want you to think. What do you think of when you hear the term family violence? Who is our primary victims in family violence? Well, most people tend to automatically think of women as being the primary victims and the primary victim targets in family violence cases. While women are not always the victims, they do tend to be the leading victim category in this subject. And so what better way to start than with a global perspective of violence against women? And here we go. All right, so here are our learning objectives for this week. And basically, this is my expectation of you'll be able to answer these questions by the end of the lecture. So you're going to be able to describe the forms of violence against women and the definition of violence against women. You'll be able to discuss the scope of the problem. And you're going to be able to kind of talk about and identify the 3 forms of immigration relief established by the VAWA, as well as discuss the status of female genital mutilation as a global concern. And then finally, you'll be able to differentiate between female feticide and femicide. As I've stated, Chapter 1 gives us a global view of violence against women. We will explore different cultural views of women and how that leads to their victimization. As stated previously, this chapter will lay the groundwork upon which we will build in terms of the overall violence within the familial setting. It's very important to start these conversations with a focus on the global view of women. As you may have learned, or if you haven't, that's okay, we'll learn it now. Cultural views of women and perceived rights or lack thereof weigh heavily on this population's treatment within the cultural setting. It is important that we make note of the different cultural views that we will discuss. Defining violence against women is not easy. While there are varying definitions of violence itself, it's important to note that there are three major themes or forms of violence globally against women. So the first form deals with the family. And I want you to pay special attention because they typically will have the same wording as far as it being physical, sexual, psychological violence, okay? So you will have, the first one will be within the family setting. And basically this is physical, sexual, psychological violence occurring within the family, including battering, sexual abuse of children in the household, dowry-related violence, which we'll talk about a little bit later, marital rape, FGM, which is female genital mutilation, and other traditional practices to harm women. The second area of violence that women experience is in the community. This is violence that occurs from a community standpoint. So this also encompasses trafficking and forced prostitution. All right. So then finally, you're going to have the state as a perpetrator of violence to women. And what that means is physical, sexual, and psychological violence perpetrated or condoned by the state wherever it occurs. And you're going to learn a little bit more about how the state actually perpetrates violence on women as we go through this chapter. So as you've read, this is a growing epidemic internationally, violence against women. Multiple countries have attempted to address this epidemic in various ways. And I am using the term epidemic because it very deliberately because it has grown into such an epidemic. In 2011, the Council of European Convention on the Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, known as the Istanbul Convention. So you don't have to remember that long name, just remember the Istanbul Convention. This convention solidified the official definition of violence against women. And as you can see on the screen, it is a violation of human rights and a form of discrimination against women and shall mean all acts of gender-based violence that result in or are likely to result in physical, sexual, psychological, or economic harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. I want you to pay very close attention to the word economic harm. All right? Note that violence refers to physical, sexual, psychological, or economic harm. These are important distinctions because most people think that violence against women is just a physical thing. So most people don't recognize the psychological damage and the economic damage that women endure with being victims of this type of violence. That's not the case with this international definition that the Istanbul Convention adopted, though. They were very careful to make sure that they covered all of their bases when coming up with this definition. And that's very important to remember, that it goes well beyond just the physical harm that women may incur. As victims tend to lack the opportunities to leave their violent situations, international relief has been attempting to happen for years. A way that this violence is being addressed is through seeking refugee status or asylum. So it's very important that we understand as we take on this endeavor that we understand the difference between a refugee and asylum. So as you read, there have been refugee status protections internationally, but those have for years. But those have rarely been utilized for women seeking to leave violent situations. The 1951 Convention related to the status of refugees and the 1967 Protocol defined international refugees as individuals with a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. If you note the dates on these documents, you notice that this predates the rising concern around women's rights. That is why gender violence is still evolving, and the study of gender violence is still evolving. One would think, just looking at this, that refugee status could be held under the membership of a particular social group, but it's really not that easy. So the United States did the Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act in 1996, which expanded the definition of a refugee to include gender violence related wording such as like forced abortion, forced sterilization, and forced prostitution. So now that you know a little bit about refugee and asylum seeking, let's look a little bit deeper. There are very specific distinctions between someone achieving refugee status and someone who is seeking asylum. The primary difference is where they physically are during the application initiation. It's worth noting that someone seeking asylum must show one of the refugee grounds was or will be one of the central reasons for their persecution. So you see that the primary difference in the United States between refugees and asylum seekers, like I said, is the location, whereas refugee status applies to persons who are outside of the United States wanting to enter, but they have not entered yet. However, if someone is seeking asylum, that is someone who is already in the United States or currently at a port of entry. All right, so those are two very different distinctions that may seem like, well, what's the big deal? But that's a very big deal in terms of how they're treated and kind of how the application is processed. So the United States is also attempting to address this international concern by enacting various federal laws that allow immigration relief to those who qualify. The Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, which was done in 2012, established 3 forms of immigration relief that directly impact this topic. The first relief is called the self-petitioning relief. Under self-petitioning, this is an option for survivors of family violence, and it allows an abused spouse, children, and parents of U.S. citizens to self-file for immigration relief. This is typically an option when the abused spouse is not a legal citizen of the United States, but the abuser, whether the spouse or partner, is a citizen of the United States. This is especially helpful and was such a great relief because, as we will learn through the cycle of domestic violence, a lot of it is about power and control. So a lot of these type of abusers would use the visa issues like revocation and being deported and things like that over their spouse's head to make them do what they needed them to do. So they used it as a form of power, the visa issues. So the self-reporting or the self-petitioning relief really kind of was groundbreaking in those scenarios and allows them to file the petition themselves and not have a fear of being deported. All right, then there are two different types of visas that are really highlighted as being major relief for immigrants or refugees in this current situation. So the first type is a U visa. And a U visa is for those who have suffered substantial physical or mental abuse as a result of criminal activity. As a caveat for this relief, the victim must be willing to cooperate with the prosecution efforts and all investigation procedures. The next type of visa is called a T visa. And the best way to kind of differentiate between a U visa and a T visa that really kind of helped me is to think of what a T visa is for. A T visa is specifically for trafficking victims. So T, trafficking. So this visa is specific relief for those victims of sexual or labor trafficking. So that is people who are brought into this country illegally for the sex trade, or people who are brought into this country illegally for labor trafficking. We'll discuss this further in the semester, but there are those who are brought into this country and exploited for both. I've had personal experiences through my career where I've had to deal with trafficking victims being brought in from other countries to work in restaurants and kind of do labor. And it really is a sad situation, especially because most of them were kids and they were brought in under the guise of having a better life. But all they were really doing was being exploited for labor, whether it be in restaurants and fields, construction, things like that. This relief particularly protects a person from deportation and allows them to legally work in the United States. All right? So you have the U visa and the T visa, and the T visa is really for trafficking, and that's the best way to describe that one. The United States is not the only country who is leading the way in trying to find relief for this epidemic. The United Nations, or the UN as I will call it, leads the efforts to protect women internationally. They've done several treaties and laws to address these concerns, and they're listed here on the slide under their acronyms. I'm going to give you the meaning of these acronyms as well as kind of tell you what each did, so make sure you are paying close attention. So in the 1979 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, established that women and men are equal. It established equality internationally for women, and it specifically modifies or abolishes any existing laws that held that women were not equal status to men. Then you have the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. This declares that violence against women is a human rights violation. So if you've taken universal justice or any of that topic of subjects, you know human rights violations occur through various formats. The Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women specifically added gendered specific violence, specifically with women, as a human rights violation internationally. And then finally, you had the UN Development Fund for Women. And that title is a little misleading I will tell you that. But basically, UNIFEM provides grant monies and technical assistance to programming whose primary focus is to address women's human rights concerns. There's a submodule that I created that's devoted specifically to female genital mutilation, or FGM. And FGM refers to all procedures involving part or total removal of the external female genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs for non-medical reasons. This subject is atrocious, and these atrocities happen every day internationally. And they also happen here in the United States. Make sure you watch the videos that I posted and read the articles to learn more about them. I specifically picked a video for your viewing requirement that shows you that this is not just an international problem, but this is really happening in the United States as well. This term is used to describe the procedure for which parents must give consent due to the age of the minor. So knowing that this happens, you know that parents are giving consent for this to happen. And I'll give you some statistics. 90% of women in Egypt have been mutilated. Even further, 98% of women ages 15 to 49 in Somalia have also been mutilated. 98% and 90%. This is happening, and it's happening at a very fast pace. And it's truly sickening, I think, when you think about it. But it is important to understand in our study that countries that utilize these type of procedures may view women as less than, and so that's a important distinction that you should probably understand. Although you're never really going to understand why someone would do something like this. But it's a cultural issue. All right, so now that I've given you some background, we're going to kind of shift some focus and go country by country. I'm not, of course, not going to cover every country, but we are going to cover the ones that are highlighted in the reading. So we're going to start out in European Union, basically, European countries. All acts of intimate partner violence are recognized as crime and fall under some type of provision in their penal code, which means that it's against the law. Victims are allowed to request measures of protection from the state and vary from financial assistance to restraining orders, kind of like it is here in the United States. However, according to the UN report in 2006, 89 states worldwide had some sort of laws prohibiting intimate partner violence. 102 states do not. While that may sound bad, there is a 50% increase in the prohibitions worldwide since 2003. It's worth noting here, although it's not directly related to the European countries, but marital rape, which we'll discuss in the future, is still not prosecutable in 53 states worldwide, which means that marital rape doesn't exist in those countries. All right, so let's look at Afghanistan. Legal reforms have been made, but there's no official reporting on the violence against women in this country. Studies have shown that in Afghanistan, husbands are responsible for 70% of the violence committed against women. 20% come from family members and 10% by strangers. A practice that is common in Afghanistan and some international countries is the practice known as honor killing. These are forms of violence that are morality based in their culture. So honor killings are common and have spread to other countries through immigration. It's a traditional practice in which men kill female relatives who is believed to have brought dishonor upon the family or the community. So fathers are often the main perpetrators, as the basis of these killings are the notion that the female has dishonored the family by being sexually active. Whether they really have been sexually active or not is not relevant. It's the perception that they have been sexually active and are not pure. And honor killings occur even when rape has happened. So it's important to note with honor killings that it truly is their morality belief that a woman should be pure during marriage, and if she is not, having either had intercourse outside of marriage or was raped before being married, that's thought of as being dishonorable to the family. All right, let's move to Australia. Australia has made some significant legislative strides in the arena around gender-based violence. Police have gained more authority when investigating violence, and all they need is a reasonable suspicion in order to initiate an investigation. So their burden is a reasonable suspicion in order to initiate that investigation. Whether or not an investigation is initiated, law enforcement is required to take some sort of action. So they either file a report on the suspected abuse, or they take action in the form of arrest or seeking court intervention immediately, things like that. A large proportion of perpetrators in this country are family members, and Aboriginal women are overrepresented as victims of violence in this country. Appropriate interventions have kind of targeted Aboriginal women, and it's still in the process of kind of forming and all of that, but there is a shift in focus to help Aboriginal women specifically because there is a recognition that they are overrepresented. All right, let's move on to Canada. Violence against women is a persistent and ongoing problem in Canada. Believe it or not, everyone thinks Canada is great, but according to statistics and research, it's still ongoing. And it's important to note here, there is no specific criminal code for violence against women in Canada. Codes that most commonly apply are assault, sexual assault, harassment, or threats of violence. So basically, they have to use those codes in order to help find some relief with the courts, because there is no specific law against violence against women. So, although violence against women continues to be an ongoing problem in Canada, spousal homicides and non-lethal assaults have declined overall. In looking at perpetrators and some of the trends in Canada around domestic violence, or intimate partner violence, as you will hear me call it as well, we see that a perpetrator typically has multiple aggressive actions before they perpetrate in the current relationship. That was actually found to have happened in 60% of the perpetrators. So 6 out of 10 had previous aggressive instances prior to the current instance that they became involved with. And I'll tell you, that's a very similar number to my experiences working in child welfare. Generational violence is real, and it plays an integral part in the overall relationship dynamic to those that have been exposed to generational violence. And it's sad, but it's ingrained in their norms. So what I mean by that is they believe it's normal. They believe that's a loving relationship. They believe that violence is normal. And that's why it's hard for outsiders to really comprehend why people stay in those type of relationships. But we'll talk a little bit more about generational violence going forward, because we see that in a trend in a couple of countries, that women who grew up with witnessing violence tend to be in violent relationships, as well as perpetrators who grew up in violent homes tend to carry on that legacy of perpetrating. Sexual assaults have also increased in Canada, and the assault category itself accounts for over half of the reports in Canada. All right, so we're going to move on to India now. And I'm not going to read everything on this slide. You can read it. But something that we have to understand specifically in this country is the notion of a dowry. And basically a dowry is a payment that the bride's family makes to the groom's family. This is a cultural practice that happens in this country. But why we have to understand that is because dowry-related deaths is one of the most common reasons that Indian women experience violence, whether that be death or any type of violence. So what happens here is, if the in-laws deem that the dowry wasn't sufficient, the bride could be killed. That is a common practice. Now, bride burning is a type of dowry death. All right? So basically, if in-laws deem that it is not, if the dowry is not adequate enough, women are killed by their husbands and his family by being doused with flammable liquids and set on fire. Another form of violence that we see in India is what's known as female feticide. So female feticide is the act of aborting a fetus because it is a female. So remember when we talked about some of the resolutions that the UN did, one of those was to attempt to bring equality to women internationally. So in theory, those resolutions would help eliminate laws that saw women as less than. However, in India, there still is a common perception that females are not as, how would you say it, desirable as males. And so you do see female feticide being a common occurrence there. Hundreds or perhaps thousands of newborn girls are murdered each year simply because they're female. And we see this more and more because the ratio from boys to girls is dwindling because of these practices. So in India, you typically have dowry-related deaths, and then you have female feticide related deaths and violence. Crimes against women in India are on the rise. There has been an increase of over 7% when last studied in 2011 to 2012 time period. 35% of women have been sexually or physically abused, studies show. So remember when I talked about generational factors earlier? Much like we discussed then, it's worth noting that women who grew up witnessing violence, their mothers were victims, are twice as likely to be victims of intimate partner violence themselves. We talk a lot about women staying, and that generational factor plays a huge role in this. India is no different, as it's been found that 2 out of 3 women never sought help for violence that they suffer. So now we're going to look at Malaysia. And it's worth noting that Malaysia has a dual legal system. So their dual legal system is Sharia law and civil law. And those two types of law act independently to protect the diverse population, which is predominantly Muslim. However, in 1994, Malaysia passed the Malaysian Domestic Violence Act. And basically this act codified the definition of domestic partner. And that definition states that you've been married or previously married, men or women, children under 18, or incapacitated adults who share a home. Those are all considered domestic partners. And at one time, Malaysia was on the forefront of combating violence against women through this act. In fact, they had a one-stop crisis center that was formed out of this. However, much like has happened throughout the world, focus and priorities shift, and slowly but surely that one-stop crisis center lost funding. And that has caused internationally scholars to call into question whether Malaysia is taking this as seriously as they should. All right, let's move on to Mexico. So when we look at Mexico, we see that there's a societal acceptance for violence against women. 1 in 5 women live in a relationship of physical or sexual abuse where domestic abuse is considered to be the most prevalent form of violence. Legal reforms have been made, but little changes have happened because of the culture there. And we typically see through various studies and scholarly expertise that culture is what's known as patriarchal, and it's misogynistic, where men are held in a higher standard. We also see what's known as femicide. Femicide is killing women because of their gender. Now, Mexico has made this a crime. However, we still see this happening, as you can see, just due to authorities not taking this as serious as probably they should. So from Mexico, we're going to move to Mozambique. And let me get a drink of water. So for those of you who don't know, Mozambique is located in South Africa. And it's helpful to understand some of the economic background of this country because it's going to help us understand the dynamics here a little bit. So Mozambique is a poor country. 3 in 4 people fall below the poverty line. And life expectancy in this country is very low, typically anywhere between 40 to 47. Polygamy is a common practice in this country, which means that a man can have multiple wives. In fact, 43% of girls ages 15 to 19 are either married, divorced, or have been widowed. Although domestic violence continues to be a serious and widespread problem, there have been laws implemented to help law enforcement address these issues in this country. In 2009, domestic violence became illegal as well as marital rape. So remember when we talked about marital rape, Mozambique, which is in South Africa, has created specific statutes that ban marital rape. Under these laws, law enforcement and the courts are empowered to address these growing concerns. Law enforcement are required and empowered to act on complaints that they receive of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, as well as the courts are empowered now to issue and enforce protective orders. Much like you see protective orders here in the United States, in other countries, courts may have not been empowered or really had the ability to enforce those type of orders for that type of crime because, as we're seeing, society changes and shifts and societal norms change and shift. But Mozambique truly kind of empowered their court system to set these protective orders in motion and have the full power of the court to enforce them. Societal practices that subjugate women continue to pose a threat to the equality of women in Mozambique, though. One example is the custom of a groom's family providing a bride price to the bride's family. Usually this is the form of money, livestock, or other goods. So this is very similar to a dowry that we saw previously. Another ritual that continues to happen in this country is known as purification. And purification is when a widow is required to have unprotected sex with a member of her deceased husband's family. Failure to be purified is cited as a reason for more than half of the widows losing their inheritance after the death of their husbands. All right. So we've looked at several countries, and we're going to continue our international exploration by going to Peru. In Peru, domestic violence laws were passed in 1997 and in 2011, but violence is still a serious problem. Enforcement is considered weak, and few men are ever prosecuted. That's because this country does not take this form of violence very seriously. In 2011, there were more women killed by family violence abusers than those that were prosecuted. The WHO, or the World Health Organization, has ranked Peru as having one of the highest rates of physical or sexual violence by a partner in the world at 70%. All right, so let's go to the Philippines. When we talk about the Philippines, we have to note that it is illegal to get divorced in the Philippines. The Philippines criminalize physical, sexual, and psychological harm against women and children from their family members, but enforcement is not very high. The police government typically is corrupt, and that corruption kind of leads to further subjugation of abuse. Because divorce is illegal in this country, more women have to stay with their abusers because they don't have an out. They can't get legal separation. They can't get an annulment. So they are forced to stay there. Thus, we see higher rates coming from the Philippines. All right, so let's go to the Republic of Iraq. So the Republic of Iraq, we see honor killings is very widespread, and we talked about honor killings earlier. But violence is the leading cause of death for women in this country, and statistics they're really hard to come by, and it's primarily because the government doesn't take domestic violence very seriously. There's a patriarchal culture in Iraq. And the majority of Iraqi men believe that they have the right to beat their wives. They have the right to control their wives. Their wives are their property. So we see that because of this cultural ingrained view of women, more violence is happening. So now we're going to move on to Russia. And I want you to set a timer for 80 minutes. When your timer goes off, 2 women in Russia would have died. That's right. A woman is killed every 40 minutes in Russia. That's over 12,000 women a year. And approximately 20 to 30% of all murders take place within the family, and that number is increasing yearly. Police don't really take this seriously, and as you can see and as you've read through chapter 1, they basically tell the victim that they're not going to do anything until there's a corpse there. Women are frequently beaten, shot, and thrown out windows in Russia. All right, so now let's go to Scotland. With Scotland, I want you to set a timer for 30 minutes. You got your timer set? All right. So when that timer goes off, 3 incidents of domestic violence will have occurred in Scotland. Yep, you guessed it. Domestic violence incidents happen and are reported every 10 minutes in this country. That's well over 53,000 a year. However, what makes Scotland so interesting is that their domestic violence laws are gender neutral. LGBTQIA plus relationships are not immune from these scenarios of violence. Studies show that in Scotland, domestic violence affects 1 in 4 of LGBTQIA plus relationships. All right, so let's go to Thailand. And Thailand is going to be a topic that you'll see is kind of, I don't want to say out of the norm, but gives us some hope when it comes to violence against women. In Thailand, they passed domestic violence legislation in 2007. And under that legislation, anybody can report abuse. It doesn't have to be the victim. Anybody can report the abuse. They also have a strong emphasis on the crisis centers. So as we go through this semester, we're going to talk a lot about crisis centers through various means. When we specifically talk about domestic violence, crisis centers are those places that victims can go to get help getting out of those relationships. Well, Thailand actually put crisis centers in state-run hospitals along with hotlines. They have temporary shelters. They have counseling services. They really saw this epidemic and are trying to get ahead of it by prevention measures. There was also a family violence law manual that was put out to the government, or by the government, to law enforcement and judges and the courts and all of that. And those actors in the system have to attend gender sensitivity trainings consistently. All right, so we've gone over a lot of information, and chapter 1 had a lot of information in it. A lot of it was probably disturbing, I would say, but it gives you kind of a global look at how violence against women is treated. And I want you to make sure that you pay particular attention to cultural values, as well as kind of what drives the domestic violence. What are those forms of domestic violence that we see? Or I call it domestic violence, but it's really violence against women. What type of violence are women subjugated to internationally? If you can answer those questions, go back to the module, go and read and watch the material on female genital mutilation. And then you should also kind of go back through this lecture. Anything you need more information on, kind of find that timestamp. Look at your book, make sure you've read the chapter, and then finally you're going to take the quiz over this section of the material. So I appreciate everyone for hanging in with me. I'm going to get you out just in under an hour. But as always, if you need anything, if you have any questions, want to discuss some of these topics a little more, feel free to drop me an email, drop by my office in Carroll, or just reach out and we can make some time to meet. All right. I hope everyone has a great week, and I will talk to you all soon. Thank you.